Hey, welcome to the For Evansville podcast. My name is Adrian, and I'm here with my coworker Sarah today, and our guest. We're talking about the Liturgy of the Neighborhood. That's our mini series that we're going through right now. And who better to have on a Liturgy of the Neighborhood podcast series than a Love Your Neighborhood director of Community One, Austin Maxheimer, but also author of the book Neighborhoods in Jesus. So
true,
he's
the
here with us
least selling book.
The least selling book.
Not best-selling.
It's not a bestseller.
I've bought 4, so.
Sarah's making it a bestseller, one purchase at a time. Today, though, we've talked a lot about neighborhoods so far in our previous episodes, so if you haven't checked those out, please do. But we haven't kind of touched on the liturgy part. So today we're going to dive into that because Austin loves liturgy.
I do.
So, all right. So we're going to talk about liturgy, and then we're going to also talk about like neighborhoods and zoning and how they got to where they are. I promise it's going to be more exciting than that just sounded. And just kind of how neighborhoods got where they are, and then formation. Like how does the things you're doing and living out in the neighborhood form who you are as a person, like liturgy. So
let's do it.
Let's get started.
Hey, welcome to the For Evansville podcast. Our goal is to advance human flourishing through the church. This podcast is a place to practice some of our core values like listening first and learning from everyone. We'll share stories to help you understand the needs and dreams of our city. We hope you'll be inspired to reimagine your faith as a catalyst for love, justice, and purpose in our city and your neighborhood. Don't just live in Evansville, be for Evansville.
Okay, Austin, I want to know what your experience with liturgy is.
Okay, well, my first love was not neighborhoods. I feel like as my life has traveled and my vocation has become about neighborhoods, as I write books about neighborhoods and Jesus, I've become, at least in our community, like the neighborhood guy. Especially in the faith community, neighborhoods. Well, let's go talk to Austin, and that's fine. I love the neighborhood work, but that's not actually my first love. Mm-hmm. My first and enduring love is the local church. It's where my training is at. I have 2 degrees in seminary in ministry, and so that's where really my first love was. But my background growing up in church was not liturgical. Okay. Decidedly not so, actually. So I grew up in Restoration Movement churches, where it was like independent Christian churches and First Christian churches, and so you might have seen those churches around town. But then they were not liturgical in any shape, form, or fashion. So it was a foreign concept to me. And then I had spent some years outside of the Christian faith, but when I first got married, my wife was a Christian, and we were having faith conversations. And my job was as a community inclusion specialist for developmentally disabled adults. So I'd take them to like movies and baseball games and bowling and things like that. And they were all Catholic. So I took them to Catholic Mass for 1.5 years. And that was during this time when God was like doing a work in me and drawing me back to Him. And I fell in love with the liturgy of the Catholic Church. I'd never been exposed to it. There was like a rich history in it, and the beauty of just like the historical precedent that had come before, and really grounding you in something bigger than yourself, and the rich history of how these liturgies came into formation. I just really fell in love with the beauty of the liturgical calendar, but I didn't know anything about it, so I went on a learning journey through Scripture just to find out what liturgy was all about, why these faith traditions did them, and why they look different in some of them, and just did a deep dive into liturgy.
Can you, for someone maybe that's listening, they're like, I don't know, what's liturgy? What is it? Like, can you give like an overview of it? Yeah,
so liturgy literally means the order of service, and so that's not too like. so when you see it expressed in the Catholic Church or Lutheran Church or these, it's a calendar through which you go through a process of going into a deeper relationship with God. That's the probably the simplest understanding, is an order of service by which you enter into the presence of God. So the Greek word liturgio just means service. So you might see it in your New Testament readings as service, and you wouldn't know that it is actually the word liturgy. And so it comes from the Old Testament process of temple worship. So it was the Levitical priests would work in the temple, and they would help the everyday person who was coming to the temple for worship or for sacrifices or bringing their offerings. The priest's role was to help them go through an order of service that went from the farm or their marketplace or their everyday lives, is the way I like to think about it, into the closest as they could get to the presence of God, into the Holy of Holies. So that would look like things like incense and immersion through baptism, washing yourself clean, and lights and flames and candles, and the process of offering that would stand in for a sacrifice that allowed you to enter into the next level. And so it was really this process of, the simplest understanding is just the order of service of the priest that helped the people of God, the Israelites or Hebrews, move from their everyday mundane life into the presence of God. And that is what liturgy is designed to do at its highest level, even today in liturgical churches.
So do you think there's a comparison to be made of work in the neighborhood? So if there's a liturgy, an order of service to bring people closer to God and into the presence of God, is there kind of an order of service in a neighborhood to bring the neighborhood closer to the kingdom of God?
Absolutely. And that's why I was so excited when I saw you guys were doing this series. And the name of it is just wonderful and so emblematic of the work that we do in neighborhoods, as we say that anyone can participate in the neighborhood revitalization efforts that we do. They don't have to have a Christian faith background or be explicitly Christian, but we are motivated by our faith and the life of Jesus to do that. So in the New Testament, with the coming of Jesus, is the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament that came before that. He fulfilled the role of the priest. He allowed us through his life to bring us from our everyday lives into the presence of God. And that through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, now we are the royal priesthood. We are the priests. And we aren't operating and serving at the temple. We are the temple of God. We are the very presence of God. And what better imagery than thinking of ourselves as the people, the sent ones into neighborhoods to help people order their lives and their communities in a way where as they go, they are experiencing the presence of God more deeply through the service of the royal priesthood, the priesthood of all believers, every one of us that are indwelt through Christ. So yeah, there's a direct connection. It's so cool.
Thank you for clarifying the name that we made up ourselves. But
well, you nailed it.
You put it in way better words than we ever could.
That's exactly what Adrian meant. When she came up with it.
Yeah. Thank you for expressing my inner thought.
I didn't know you were such an Old Testament scholar.
Clearly. Okay, so before we talk about how it shapes other people, how has it shaped you?
Oh my goodness. I don't know that I was prepared for that question, because it's like the totality of my being. Like it's transformed how I think about outreach ministry. It's transformed how I think about my everyday life and position in society as a white middle-class man. It's repositioned how I think about people in need. It's transformed how I think about just church in general and the purposes of the church. So I would say that each one of those are a subtopic in and of itself, but I would say it's just been a total transformation. But maybe the most important part of it is in the practice of doing that the transformation happened. So it wasn't learning a bunch of front-end stuff conceptually. It was through practicing. Now, conceptual understanding is really important. Like, hopefully someone out there listening had a little bit better understanding of liturgy through just expressing these concepts, but nothing replaces the practice of it. And so even in the word liturgy itself, it is the idea of embodying practices values, embodied values through practice is central to what it is. And without that practice, that transformation or formation in myself wouldn't have happened.
Wow. Okay. Do you have any specific examples? Are there like certain points along the way that you're like, this was a pivotal moment for me?
Yeah, and I feel like I've shared the story 1,000 times, but it's probably worth sharing again. So the very first time I stepped into practicing neighborhood work, not even knowing what I was doing, was a major transformation moment, and I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
So there was an all call for volunteers to go door knocking in the East End in Henderson because the local church that I was a part of was going to help start a neighborhood revitalization effort in that community. And so they said, if you want to go hang out and listen to neighbors and collect SWOT analysis, show up Saturday morning, we'll train you real quick on how to listen, and then you're just going to go. And I didn't know anything about neighborhood work, but I was like, oh, that sounds like something Jesus would do. So I did it. I volunteered to go. So we got trained real quick, and we went knocking on doors. And through that process, it was about 3-hour volunteer experience, and I knocked on maybe 50 doors, talked to 7 neighbors, collected 7 SWOT analysis. If you don't know what SWOT is, it's just a way to listen. It just means what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of your neighborhood.
We go through that in a previous episode, so
okay.
you can check that out.
Zoom through. Okay.
Yeah.
So so that listening at the end of that day, actually, through the process of that day, my mind was transformed from I'm here volunteering to help these people of need to, oh my gosh, these are people with passions, skills, dreams, hopes. They're no different than me. Oh yeah, they're created in the image of God, and Jesus came to die for them. And so they're people not of need, but of people of infinite worth and inherent dignity. And so that transformation happened. I mean, I don't know that I said that day, like at lunch.
Very eloquent.
But that was the understanding. That was the transformation that happened in my mind is, okay, I'm not here to serve these poor people, but I'm here simply to be the liturgical priest, the person who's helping order this service in a way that brings them into deeper relationship with God.
I love that. Like hearing that and seeing how what you're doing now from that story, from then to now. And even as you just said, like we talked about that on a previous episode, the SWOT analysis, which they learned from training that Austin is now teaching. So it's like you were trained quickly. I'd like that you said that. They quickly trained us, then we went out and did. But also that there's still work happening in the East End of Henderson from some of that stuff. It's still happening, and I think that's important to note. But also to see how that's, I don't know how far we want to jump into like what you're doing some of that now, but like that you're now training other people to do those things, which again is very liturgical in a different way, right? You know, to be able to learn something, to then multiply it out, to then be able to share it for more people to be able to in those spaces.
Yeah, I always just think of it as discipleship. So, discipleship is a little bit of a loaded word because everyone means something a little different by it. But the simplest understanding that I have of discipleship is Jesus' first invitation to the 4 disciples that he called. He said, follow me. So it was an invitation to follow him in his life. And that as they are going, he will make them into fishers of men. So you could say, come follow me, and as we go, we will see transformation. I will make you into, as we go and practice these things, I will shape you into my likeness. And so obviously not my likeness, but as we extend that same invitation to other Christians and other followers of Jesus, that's simply what we're doing. And so that's what I've just done. I've invited others to follow me as I follow Jesus in the neighborhood revitalization. And I'd like to think and hope, and there is some fruit and proof of it, that others are being multiplied into this work also. Yeah.
So something that you keep emphasizing, which I know you do this intentionally, is people, the transformation happens when they're doing the work, not learning about it.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of your dissertation, your book are based on. And so do you want to talk about just kind of some of the research that you've done? Because it is backed by actual research.
Yes, that was quite a steep learning curve, was doing my dissertation and understanding what real research is, because what I had always thought of research is actually something called literature review. So you're just reading the literature. That's not research. That's just reviewing what other researchers people have done. Yeah. So I don't have this social sciences degree. I'm not a data analyst. So it was very hard work. But it came about from a problem. problem. So we were trying to solve a ministry problem. And so while God was clearly shaping my heart and seeing neighborhood revitalization as an expression of Jesus's ministry to marginalized neighbors, I looked around at the landscape around me, and where I would expect to see Christians in churches, I didn't see Christians in churches. When you think about the gospel being the light in some of the darkest places in our communities, that's the hope. The transformation will come, that the kingdom will come, God's will be done. You would expect to see in challenging places, neighbors facing barriers to flourishing. That's where the church should be in my mind. And that's certainly how I got there. I got there through my local church. And so after practicing neighborhood work for a while and trying to mobilize both my church and other Christians into the work, I realized that in the landscape around, I just didn't see a lot of intentional efforts. I didn't see a lot of church engagement. I didn't see a lot of missionaries in our local context coming to live out their faith in this way. And so the ministry problem that I was trying to solve was, how do we catalyze engagement by Christians and churches into neighborhood work, and how do we sustain it? And so my research questions that I formed was, what are the biblical foundations for that? Because I do think sometimes I minimize concepts and like classroom type learning, but it's still very important. You have to have a space where you're getting, like Jesus took the disciples into a private room and explained things sometimes, right? So it's not only through the practice, it's both and, not an either or. But I feel like we've de-emphasized the practice of faith disciplines and replaced it with head knowledge. And so it's not an either or, it's both and. I just emphasize practicing because I feel like that's the piece that's missing. Yeah. So the research was designed to find the biblical foundations for what motivates Christians who are engaging in this work. So I interviewed 15 local Christians that I knew were participating in neighborhood revitalization as a motivation from their faith. So we did qualitative listening there. And then I wanted to see what moved them into it the first time, like what started them in the work, but then also what sustained them in the work. Because neighborhood revitalization, my old boss and friend Eric Cummings says, these neighbors didn't get to the state they're in overnight, and they're not going to change overnight. And so in order to see, for example, we've been doing lead agency work in the TP Park neighborhood for 7 years. In October, it'll be 7 full years. We're starting to see some outcomes and fruit of that, but we haven't seen like some crazy dramatic transformation. And so I needed to find through the research not only what moved disciples of Jesus into the work, but what sustains them in the work. And so that was done through congregational surveys. So I had quantitative data too. So we surveyed, or I surveyed through my dissertation research, 5 congregations that were not participating in neighborhood revitalization. And so I used those 2 tools and methods of research to come up with the answer to that, or at least some hypotheses of what might help at very least.
Sure. So for our listeners, you can basically read all of this in the Neighborhoods in Jesus. So we won't go into all of that, but what is like 1 or 2 big things that maybe shocked you out of your research?
Oh goodness. Yeah, because a lot of the findings actually weren't very shocking. So like the 5 biblical themes.
Maybe that's the shocking thing.
Well, yeah, it's things you'd expect.
Simpler.
So just very quick summary. And again, like Adrian, like you said, we won't get too deep into it, but like the 5 biblical themes that emerged from the listening data for what motivated Christians to participate in the work was just a sense of calling, evangelism or discipleship, like taking your next step in faith, understanding the mission of God, hope specifically tied to the resurrection, and then incarnation, like this idea of dwelling with the people that you're doing ministry with, like Jesus did. Mm-hmm. None of those were really surprising.
Right. So then where's the disconnect?
Well, we're getting to that.
Okay.
So, yeah,
all right.
good question.
Setting you up for this.
Yeah, setting up perfectly. But then just hitting these real quick to show that, again, it wasn't really too surprising. The things that catalyzed Christian engagement was just an invitation, someone inviting them to come and see in the neighborhood, taking that people's understanding that they needed to do a step of faith, like they needed to get out of their comfort zone, and this was a way through which they do that. And then participation in holistic ministry, like, okay, I clothed you, but then you're back the next week for more clothes or more food. Like, so meeting a need is good, but really we're called to be flourishing in all of our being. And as ministry, that's God's hope for a neighbor is not to make it to the next day, but to be thriving and flourishing in life. And so the people that were stepping into the neighborhood work, they desired to see that sort of to participate in that sort of ministry. And then that sustains engagement. Just if you see positive movement, I think that's sustains anyone's engagement in any context.
So
right?
that'd be like storytelling?
Yeah, storytelling, or like specific to neighborhood work. Like, okay, I drove past this building for 5 years and it was an old dilapidated commercial just building that no one was using. Now it's Bedford Collab. I see movement. Getting to know neighbors, if you're building real relationships with neighbors, and then serving with other Christians in community. Like those were the three main things that sustain people in engagement. And so none of those are really surprising. Right. It's not shocking. So probably the biggest shocking or thing that caught me completely off guard was in the congregational survey, the way that I was trying to get to what the biblical foundations were is that I asked a set of what would be like classic orthodox doctrinal questions from Christianity, like there is a God and Jesus saves our lives, So there was almost no deviation between the assent to these statements from a knowledge perspective. Like there was almost all of them across 5 different congregations, all different denominations, church plants, mainline, across a very wide swath of Christian thinking. All of them assented almost unilaterally to all those documents. So think of 5s across the board. Then you get into the role of the church, and there starts to be some variation. So I wanted to ask them what they thought the church's role was in ministry to neighbors in neighborhoods like TP Park. And then you started seeing a jagged line. There was a little bit of, but then you asked how they're practicing their faith and action section. So the survey had 3 different, like, what are your doctrinal views? What's your view of the role of the church? And then what does your faith look like in practice? And when it got down to the faith and practice, it was crazy jagged with drops all over the place, meaning that they weren't actively living out these statements of faith, seeing their faith in practice. So there was a major disconnect between cognitive assent to ideas or concepts of our faith and the practice of our faith, which, when you think about your life, like that's not too surprising. But what was fascinating was when I only pulled out the group that was actively participating in faith, they had a lot more deviation in their beliefs, meaning, okay, so sorry if that got technical or if you're confused.
Yeah, let's put in
the simplest term is that the practicing of your faith does not necessarily equate or have a direct correlation to the ideas that you say you believe in. Yeah, your belief in these statements.
So the surer you are, it's like the less you practice it.
Yeah, you could almost make that argument. Now we would need further research to actually discover that more.
But it was headed that way.
It was headed that way. Yeah.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Which leads to more like wanting to figure out like, okay, what do we do about that? Like, what's the step you take from that? But I think I have to go back for a minute. Like, I think it's a really interesting, if we were talking about your personal journey, stepping into that. But so you went from, you had one idea. Did you have a master's at that point? Did you have your master's degree?
I did, yeah.
I thought you did. So you had your master's at that point, and missional communities, like focused in some of those things as well. But then going and doing this work made a shift not only to your work, your job, your career, and then went back and got a doctorate in this same idea based on doing the work.
It was largely motivated by 2 things. One was I had a faith crush on Alan Hirsch and Michael Frost. They were very formative in my thinking, and they were being guest professors for that course. So that was number 1. But number 2 was more out of failure. So while I was on staff at the local church, my technical title was small groups or life groups director. But I had always seen the power, the potential of small groups of decentralized Christians being the light of Christ in the community, being sent to where they could make the most impact in the flow of their everyday lives. And so that's just the missional conversation, right? You've had conversations with Tim Sorens on here and others, that I was really captured early on by that idea. And so I had tried to lead that in my role of just trying to see, I even wrote another book called From Couch to Community, just trying to activate what I saw as the potential of small groups, that not just to be holding tanks for Christian community in people's living rooms, but what if they actually caught the vision of being kingdom bearers and the light of Christ in the world as little small, little missional communities deployed where big churches can't go, or like institutional organizational churches go. And so we actually led that and tried to do that at our church, and there were some successes and whatever, but it kind of fell flat, and there's lots of reasons for that we could explore maybe in another conversation. But it was out of seeing the transformation that God had done in my heart and mind through doing this work, seeing it land flat. I wanted to go learn from other practitioners about how we could mobilize missional communities here locally, and just had the opportunity to go do that over at Asbury, not that far away in Lexington. So yeah, it was really a desire to fix a problem, which ended up working out well and did change my vocation. Yeah.
I just think that's super unique to think, that to see something that really impacts you, but then to make all these changes sort of in your life in a different direction and empower you to now empower other people to continue that. I think it's beautiful.
Thank you.
So we've kind of asked almost everybody on here of how to get a congregation. You said you learned by failing.
Yeah.
So what would you say now to maybe to your old self in that time?
I would say,
don't do it.
I would tell myself to mind the gap.
Oh, wow. Another book he wrote. Wow.
Just
plug them.
We're just going to have a list of links
Check
to
the
all
notes
of
out.
Austin's
Austin's got a website.
Yeah, I hired a publicist to do that. No, so that's a little bit of a joke, but also very serious, is one of the things that God taught me through that was that I'm only responsible for my offering. I'm not responsible for the outcomes. And I think that's the gospel living in our lives, is that I can work really, really hard and even effectively and even do exactly what I'm supposed to do, and that doesn't mean it's going to produce the kingdom outcomes that God wants to create. And in fact, if I don't allow for God's movement in there, then I'm playing the role of God. I can control and manipulate the oneness to create the outcomes that I think need to happen. And so one is just to take a deep breath and be a little easier on yourself. That's what I would tell myself. The second big learning I had through doing that, which is really important to this conversation, is I realized that a lot of Christians, meaning well and sincere in their faith. I'm not trying to be hypercritical of people, but I found that they weren't spending time with Jesus. Like they weren't sitting at his feet. They weren't just basking in his presence. They weren't allowing Jesus' life to inform and transform how they walked out their faith. If you're not spending time with Jesus, how could Jesus do that, right? And so what I realized was that why would people be on mission with Jesus if they're not spending time with Jesus? Why would they follow Jesus into the mission field if they are not being shaped actively by observing Jesus' life and following him? So that would be number one, is I would flip the order of how I did things, because I was ready to go, because I had spent a lot of time with Jesus, and so I was ready to activate people that were maybe a few steps back here. And so I would have spent a much, much, much longer time helping people within my local church just be with Jesus, just sit with Jesus, just allow the Holy Spirit to inform and transform their lives as they follow him, instead of trying to prescribe a methodology of missional engagement in our community for kingdom purposes, like, you know what I mean? So that's number one. And then probably the last thing I would have done is I would have started a lot smaller. So at the time, we had over 60 life groups at our church. We had over 800 people in our groups ministry, which is really, looking back on it, it's like, wow, that was really cool and like really neat. And there's probably some reflection we should do on that, about how we got to that point. But what we tried to do is we tried to shift all of our groups at once to be from this life group type of small group classic ministry to missional groups. And we tried to do it all at once. And I mean, we thought we were doing it right at the time. We had curriculums and sermon series, and but I would have started, instead of some like big campaign to shift everyone, I would have just started with a few healthy missional communities and allowed it to multiply from there.
Okay. Yeah. And that's on our podcast with Tim Sorens, that's kind of his philosophy as well.
Yeah, that's a good one.
He
probably failed too.
Yeah, haven't we all failed? Yeah, but just
works.
Start small and share those stories. And when people see those stories and hear those stories, then that gets them excited. And then they want to join in on that and be a part of it. So you share a lot of stories in your book.
Yes.
Sarah is also familiar with your book, and she has a couple of stories that she wants you to share from it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I think it's important too. You've talked about, your role as Living Neighborhood Director at Community One, and the work that Community One does is assets-based. And I don't know if you need to maybe explain that a little bit, but that's really important to the role of how you guys are going about listening, because you talked about going in and listening to SWOT analysis, but it's all focused again on the people in the community are the assets of the community, and we're not coming in and saying like, hey, we're going to change all these things, but what's going really well here? Tell me what you love about your community, and how can we help continue to breathe life into that and give opportunities as you guys are creating things. So I know a couple stories that come to mind. I think one that's always just really simple is as you guys were meeting people, you started getting this like, hey, you got to meet.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit of those? Because I think that still happens all the time now.
Yeah.
It's important.
Yeah. So the first thing that we do in a Love Your Neighborhood initiative is we're practicing assets-based community development. And you explained it pretty good. I'll just maybe add one quick note.
That's fine.
Is a lot of times, even churches, but communities, as they try to develop the communities, they'll look at the need. So it's even called need assessment, right? Or we'll look at a community as a church and say, who do we want to serve? Because we want to serve people in need. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I want to be careful to say, like, we should be helping our neighbors in need. That's a good impulse. But when you only focus on the deficits that are latent in a community, then you have nothing to build from. And so an assets-based approach just looks at the people as the greatest asset. You could also look at other organizations, other things like parks and infrastructure, that's strengths, but we want to draw and build on the strengths. And I personally believe that the Christian worldview or view of reality is uniquely positioned to fuel this work and to drive it forward, because it is within our view of people through the Christian, view of life, that the greatest asset of any community is people, because we are literally created in the image of God. And so we are God's image bearers in the world, mandated and empowered by His Spirit to bring heaven to earth. So that's really, really important. And I think Christians are, again, uniquely positioned to practice this work. But in the first year in a Love Your Neighborhood initiative, assuming that maybe you're a stranger to the neighborhood, or that neighbors don't know you, we set goals simply for meeting neighbors and listening to them. And so one of the greatest things that can ever happen for us in the work is that we build trust and equity with a neighbor who then opens up their network to us. So what you're referencing there is that as we were doing what we call pop-up experiments, just trying to get out in the neighborhood and meet neighbors, we hired a neighbor who's Evansville famous, DeAndre Wilson, to roll a tire through every block in the neighborhood. And then me and Merrick, who was our person on the ground, just rode behind him on bikes. And as neighbors came out to say, why is this guy rolling a monster truck through our streets? We just engaged neighbors and talked to them. And so one of those neighbors we met, his name is LaTerrence. And so we Merrick followed up with them, had coffee, did the listening, because when you listen to someone, you immediately create value in them because they have something to say and you're respecting that, which is, another really important thing of listening. Reason for why for listening. But after we built that relationship and trust with Terrence, he's like, oh, you got to meet Tashia. And so Tashia was his next door neighbor. He's like, you're awesome, or she's awesome. You got to meet her. So we did. We followed up. We met her. We found out she's an amazing event planner. She's just a go-getter, an entrepreneur, just an amazing high-capacity person. After she helped us with several things in the neighborhood, and we got to know her, she's like, oh, you got to meet Cord. Cord is her brother. He's an amazing artist. He has an art studio. He teaches art to kids. He did a residency at the Children's Museum this past year as artist in residence. And so that's the way this work is designed to roll out, is that it creates a mesh network of neighbors that are bonded and connected to one another. And so the sweetest words that we can hear, and there's actually a biblical principle and idea of this called a person of peace. As Jesus sent out the 72, he said, go meet a person of peace, and if they welcome you, stay in their home. And what happens in that culture is when you stayed in their home, they opened up their network to you. And so whereas you may know one neighbor, that neighbor knows 8 neighbors, and those neighbors know 24 neighbors, and that's how you can see a multiplicative effect in the relational equity and trust that you build in neighborhoods, is by hearing those sweet words of you got to meet.
Awesome.
They're so good. And I think too, even from our organization, we've met with a couple people from that you guys have met and been able to say like, hey, these people are incredible. And like one of them we just hired to do an event for us to, she made all of the food and desserts at our event, and they're incredible. And it's like one of those, again, that we may not have been able to connect with her without someone connecting us first. And there's just a lot of opportunity to learn of the assets there. A creative that we met with recently who also I know lives in the Park neighborhood, and talking about how can we use some of the services. They're really, really talented. They have an incredible team, and we're excited to look at some of those things. So again, like it's the assets that are benefit for their community, but also for our city. And we want to be a part of like learning all of those. So that's what's really unique and fun about our organization too.
Yeah, and they're in these neighborhoods that, as growing up as a person from Evansville, like I hear the names of those neighborhoods and I have my own ideas of who lives there, and it's super general and really uninformed except by like media, and it's like that's really inaccurate. Like when you share these stories, we need to hear the positive stories. We need to share those positive stories. And so I think storytelling is a huge aspect of that, because we want to change the narrative of those neighborhoods.
Yeah, absolutely. And I moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, and some of the things that are said are true. Like there's truth in them. Happen. Like I hear gunshots out of my window. Like, so there are violence. We've seen murders in the neighborhood. There are challenges. So we don't want to ignore the very real challenges, because that also does a disservice to neighbors if we act like, oh, everything's just great, if we only focus on the assets. But in the storytelling, what stories are we telling? What stories are we reproducing? On the news, for example, you mentioned that there's one murder in the neighborhood, which is horrible and horrific, and we should do something about that, right? But what's not told is I think hundreds of thousands of acts of love between neighbors every single day. And when you get proximate and move into the neighborhood, you start to see and experience those every single day of your life, and it completely transforms the narrative. Yeah. But even the goal being, and what we try to practice, and we're still learning in this, is even taking it one step further of, okay, we need to tell a different story about the neighborhoods instead of placing a narrative onto them, but what would it look like for the neighborhood to tell its own story? Yeah. And that is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do, is create a sustainable community that doesn't even need us at all. It doesn't need a lead agency, it doesn't need a full-time neighborhood champion, but it's just a flourishing neighborhood that sustains itself and tells its own story. And that's our ultimate goal and what we're working towards.
So when you say the neighborhood tells its own story, you have these Love Your Neighborhood networks in multiple neighborhoods. And are you seeing that each neighborhood, it has its own unique story?
Absolutely.
And why is that? Do you know why each neighborhood has its own story?
Yes. Well, I know parts of why.
Yeah.
So it's because neighborhoods are shaped and transformed or formed by processes and systems and structures that make it what it is. And it's a very complex thing. And you mentioned zoning. Is this where we want to get into that?
I don't know. Like, do we want to save this for another episode?
Okay, we could maybe do that.
But I also actually think it ties in. We were discussing this earlier in the office and made this connection of a secular liturgy that shapes the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So when Christians or believers come into or are thinking about neighborhoods, it's this neighborhood or myself or anything can be applied to. There are systems in place that are shaping me, and what am I moving towards?
Yeah.
And so we've seen that these neighborhoods have been shaped by these zoning things or whatever we can get into, and so that's moving them towards something. And so we want to change the narrative to where we are moving them towards more of a kingdom-minded, where they can flourish and become who God wants them to become in their own neighborhood. So we can get into like where are they headed if they don't have intervention, I guess.
Yeah. So I'm going to butcher these. What do they say? 95% of all stats are made up on the spot. So I'm going to butcher these. But since 1970, I just read this in the book Fragile Neighborhoods, which is really strongly recommended. It's a good supplement to Neighborhoods in Jesus, which you can get on Amazon. Not just kidding. So,
You still can, though.
But he makes the case for why neighborhoods really, really well and concisely, way more concisely than I can. But one of the things that he says is that since 1970, the number of people experiencing poverty has increased threefold, and the density of neighbors experiencing poverty has doubled. And so at a time when global poverty has halved 3 times, like we've went from like 40% to 20% to 8%, American poverty is increasing. And so without getting too deep into the weeds, again, if you want to save that for another conversation, the systems and places or the liturgy or the order of life that people are following just at a sociological level are not leading to flourishing. If anything, they're leading to more and more levels of unflourishing, of despair, of lack of wholeness of being. And so, we do need an intervention. And so asset-based community development is the one that community adopted, and the Love Your Neighborhood framework is an adaptation of that. And what we do is after we do that year of listening and resident engagement, we help the neighborhood identify where they want their neighborhood to go and publish that in an actual plan. So that way, as a community, we have a picture or an image of where we want to go together, not as individuals, which is really important too, but as a community, which we've lost a lot of sense of belonging and connection of community in America. And so coming in is, okay, we're building a mesh network of neighbors, and we're giving them their own that they designed, that they informed, that they did. We're giving them a telos or a destination or a place from which we are going together, and we assent to that together and agree on that together. And then as we break the huddle and go work in our everyday 9-to-5 jobs or in our family life or in our social life, this is the shared outcome that we have together. Then we pursue it together kind of in a decentralized way. I don't know if any of that made sense, but.
Yes. If I play it on 0.5 speed.
Slow it down. Andy Miles always tells me I have to slow my talking down.
This will make good sound bites
smart.
for us, like little reels, to get people to listen to the whole conversation.
Yeah.
That'll be perfect.
I have a couple questions. I know we're
Yeah.
getting close to the end, though, but
Yeah, that's good.
well, one is first, as we talk about neighbors, we hear the term a lot, marginalized neighbors. Can you explain what that means? Because I think that's really important for people to understand margins.
Yeah, and I almost it's hard to use words these days in our culture. It feels like you always have to be careful. And what I want to say is different people have different understandings of marginalization, and I recognize that. I want to say that when I use the term, It is not meant to be a value, indictment or value placement onto a neighbor. That is not what I mean at all. What I mean is that just certain people, by virtue of a lot of complex reasons, find themselves pushed to the edges of society. That could be because of race. That could be because of socioeconomic realities. That could be decisions that people have made consciously, mistakes that they've made. So for whatever reason, there's a center of every society or culture. And as neighbors that are living out their life, some of them, by virtue of those complex realities, are pushed to the edges of society. And that's simply what I mean. They're on the margins of society for any number of reasons. Now, bringing in our faith perspective, we would say that we're all marginalized from the greatest source of being, and that's in a relationship with God. And so the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And so that's just another way to say the wholeness of your being. And so those neighbors that are facing marginalization, they're at risk in the whole of their being, in their heart, mind, soul, and strength, from loving God with all that they are. And because at the center of society, I don't know if we should go there or not. You might have to edit this out. But I was really shaped by this idea of orphans and widows and sojourners in the Old Testament, and they're lumped together in a formulaic way. And I had this epiphany one day through prayer that the reason why is because they were in a society where the center of the society was agriculture and patriarchy, land and fathers. And those orphans, widows, and sojourners were the ones that were landless and fatherless. So they were pushed to the edges of their society where they were at risk. They were hungry. They didn't have protection. They oftentimes had to make life decisions, which their heart, their will, that it was stolen from them. They weren't able to make decisions that other people were made. And so the call for the people of God over and over and over again, the refrain in the Old Testament is for the people of God to bring the marginalized, the orphans, widows, and sojourners back to the center, where they can experience full flourishing in the wholeness of their being, where they can have a relationship with God. Those barriers are removed. And that's our job as liturgical priests in the neighborhood, is to help remove those barriers for our marginalized neighbors.
I think it brings us and ties the liturgy back into it. If a service had a liturgy that pushed people away and pushed them into the margins, then we would not hesitate on a Sunday to change that liturgy.
Yeah.
Take the Sunday service out of it into our everyday lives, which Jesus called us to, which you just so clearly put, that it's now the job and the work of the church to change that in people's everyday lives the other 6 days of the week, and change the liturgy of the neighborhood.
Amen.
What's in there?
Let's do it.
Thanks, Austin.
Yeah, thank you.